Hey everyone, we'll get started in about a minute, but if you want to go ahead and open the files for today, there's a handout that you can take notes on. Just make sure you are making a copy or downloading it for yourself, and we'll get started in about a minute. All right, hello everyone. Thanks for joining me. Happy Monday. It's good to see you. I hope you guys all had a good weekend. I am Mrs. Velitis. There you go, Mrs. Velitis. I'm an English teacher at Naperville North High School, about an hour or so outside of Chicago. It's good to see you guys. On Friday, we started talking about writing in terms of good versus great, and we'll do that again today and tomorrow. I think it's just an easy way to kind of approach these online lessons since I don't see you every day and I can't see if you're making the like face or the face. I feel like this is a good way for you to kind of discern which camp you fall in. So I'll refer to things as good or great. If it's good, those are kind of like the basic, quick, easy to do, essential pieces of information. It shows an adequate understanding of the task itself. I am about 5.5 months pregnant, and I feel like all I do is eat sweets, which is terrible. And I know my doctor would yell at me. Yesterday, I made Rice Krispie treats. We had Rice Krispie treats. I had jelly beans, a chocolate bunny. I mean, I just pigged out. So I clearly have desserts on the brain. I like to think of good writing as kind of like a chocolate ice cream cone. It's good, it's satisfying, it gets the job done. For this pregnant woman, I'm going to be very happy with a chocolate ice cream. However, a great is going to knock your socks off. It's going to be amazing and really insightful. It's going to reflect more sophistication. It's going to go beyond the basics of just getting the job done. So in this case, to me, a great ice cream would be on a waffle cone. I love waffle cones. And I also love Moose Tracks. That's the vanilla ice cream with like swirls of fudge and then peanut butter cups in it. I would be happy with both. If my husband came home from work today with either ice cream, I'd be very satisfied. But sometimes you want a little bit more. And that's what we'll be focusing on. So we looked at it on Friday, we'll look at it today and tomorrow of some elements of good writing and then how you can take those good elements and turn them into great. My goal is just to give you many tools that you can put in your toolbox that you can use as you see fit when it comes to that exam on May 20th. So Friday specifically, we were talking about introductions. And a good introduction, one that's just fine, it would make me as an English teacher very happy. A good introduction is going to have approximately 3 or 4 of those components of the rhetorical situation. We review that it would have a thesis statement, and it's going to be about 2 or 3 sentences. If you find yourself reading a prompt or a passage and not really knowing what to do with it, the tip I gave you was identify the rhetorical situation, chunk out the passage, and then just quickly cover in your introduction, mainly the rhetorical situation. However, if you have a good understanding and you're doing a pretty good job with your time management, then maybe you push for a great introduction. That's where you have at least 5 of the 6 components of the rhetorical situation. It has a thesis. It's going to be about 3 to 5 sentences total. And you would do at least one of the following. You might reference the broader context or the larger issues that are being revealed through the passage. You might incorporate your own writing style, and that might happen through a scenario, like possibly you are setting the scene, you are covering the 5 senses through some sort of an image, or it could be through very bold, striking language. So it could be in terms of ideas or your word choice. So that's what we covered on Friday. And I asked students to write an introduction for the Margaret Thatcher eulogy that she delivered for Ronald Reagan. And since I can't see what you guys wrote, I'm going to give you a sample of an introduction and ask for you to determine, pause the recording, and determine, is this a good or a great introduction and why? Keeping in mind those traits of what a good versus a great introduction would include. So how many of those elements do you see here in this introduction? Pause the recording for about a minute or so, do a quick skim, and determine, is it good or great and why? All right, so here's the answer. First, I see that the student has a thesis, so that could be either good or great. The thesis is going to address, or tells us the essay will include a strong appeal to pathos, a first person point of view, and rallying buzzwords. So I know the student has a thesis. Beyond that though, I noticed in the very beginning, the student opens with some of the broader context, specifically loss in general and what it means to lose someone. The student moves outside of the immediate in the eulogy itself and starts to think about what's really going on. So the student has the broader context. I do see, or what I think is a pretty nice piece of style, is looking at some of the language choices. A uniting and reassuring voice, a divided and anxious group, that I can see some attempts at least at style. The student then gives some rhetorical situation in that sentence that you can see here that starts with the former prime minister, dot, dot, dot. And then the student again has a thesis. At this point, the student has a great introduction because they're at least trying some of those elements of a great one, like the broader context and the style. And it is between 3 and 5 sentences. So I would classify this one as a great introduction. What I would encourage you to do now is to pause the recording, look at your own introduction and see if you can annotate it for any of those elements and determine if you are good or great. All right, so on Friday, we talked about the introduction, but we just briefly glossed over maybe the most important piece of the introduction, and that's the thesis statement. I'm a Schitt's Creek fan. It's been a tough loss saying goodbye to Schitt's Creek. But I think that this is a perfect gift to kind of capture English teachers in general and how strongly we feel about thesis statements. I think if you asked any English teacher, they would say, here's how I would like for you to write it. So I will say it's a very difficult task for me to try to teach you when we can't practice it over multiple settings. A thesis is not something you're going to learn just in a 30-minute video. It's something you have to practice and get feedback on and hear what certain samples might look like from your teacher. So my first tip is, if you find yourself unsure of what to do, go back to your notes that your English teachers provided you about a thesis statement. If you don't have those notes, try to email the teacher and say, hey, what would you recommend? What do you think a good thesis for a good thesis for a rhetorical analysis would include or look like? I'm going to teach you in a way that I would teach my students. I'm going to give you some tips that I would give them in a whole lesson. So take it as you will. Again, I would always encourage you to go back to what your teacher has advised and maybe just use this as a way to better understand what you've already been taught. AP specifically describes a thesis statement as the main overarching claim a writer is seeking to defend or approve. In this case, you're the writer. So it's what is the main overarching claim in your essay that you're going to have to defend or prove because it goes beyond the obvious interpretation or you to provide some evidence for it. AP says it doesn't necessarily have to be a single sentence or an explicit statement. And that is true. However, if you were in my classroom, I would strongly encourage you to fit it all into one sentence. Excuse me. To fit it all into one sentence and to make it clear. If it is explicit and it is clear, then it guides you and your thought process so much more. So when we ask you to put your thesis statement into one sentence, It's just as much for you as it is for us. It gives you the direction that you need. It's also a lot more concise. If you were to spread it out beyond a sentence, it's kind of hard to track, and sometimes then it gets a little convoluted. AP also says that it may preview the line of reasoning, and that basically says like where your essay is going to go, the direction of your essay. However, it's not to say that it must list the points of the argument, aspects to be analyzed, or specific evidence. Instead, you want it to be more broad and open-ended and more abstract, which is tough to do in a timed setting. So I see this last bullet point kind of operating in two manners. You can go this way or you can go this way. You'll see that for me today, the first sentence will be our good and the second will be our great thesis statement. Before we do that, I just want to make sure you guys are all aware of how you'll be evaluated for the thesis statement. The statement itself is its own category on your rubric. So it's really important that you understand how those points are being assigned. Pause the recording and take a few moments to read through the description for the scoring criteria, the decision rules and notes, and the additional notes to help ground our discussion for today. And you might start thinking about, if you had to underline it, what are some key traits you would underline? What are some things that this rubric tells me I should do and I should not do? Pause it, take about a minute or two to read through it, and then I'll give you some tips. All right. There are three things that I think really stand out in this particular row of the rubric. It's that students need to be able to respond to the prompt, it needs to be defensible, and it needs to analyze the writer's choices. That's what we're going to focus on today. They do tell you a few things you should avoid, like don't just restate the prompt, don't summarize the prompt. And I would encourage you to, I've said this before, use the prompt. It's your friend. Use the prompt to help guide you. But essentially, the three things you must do: respond to the prompt, make sure it's defensible, and then analyze the writer's choices. So before we get started with some samples and how you construct a thesis statement, I'm going to give you a few tips that I think are really helpful. We'll be using the Madeline Albright prompt. I've typed it up down below. You also have access to that in your files that the URL at the show more part of the YouTube video has. But you could always just read the prompt here if that's helpful for you too. One thing to think about is, how am I going to make sure I'm actually responding to the prompt? I am not off task, that I am doing what I have been asked to do. And I think a great trick for that is to turn the prompt into a question that you must answer. So toward the bottom, you can see that you're supposed to write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices Albright makes to convey her message about the importance of perseverance. I would maybe take that, flip it around, and turn it into a question like, what is Albright's message about perseverance? What is Albright arguing about the importance of perseverance? Or even just, according to Albright, in what way is perseverance important? That if you think about that prompt in the form of a question, that really helps guide your thesis and your essay in general. Another thing to think about is, how can you make it defensible? According to the rubric, defensible really just means that you have evidence to support. I think it's a lot easier to do this with argument or synthesis, but with rhetorical analysis, you've got to think, how can I go beyond just what the prompt has given me? That's where some of that interpretation comes into play, and thinking about, if this was the purpose and message in the prompt, how can I go beyond that? And that will help to make it more defensible. And then the last thing that you must do for your thesis is analyze the writer's rhetorical choices, which begs the question, what is a rhetorical choice? All right, a rhetorical choice, I referenced this last week. It could be a device or a strategy. And I don't know that you necessarily need to be so hung up on the language and being able to clarify which one is which. I will be highlighting that though, because I think that might help you think of, how am I going to structure my thesis? Which approach am I going to take? So a device, those will be things that like you can spot immediately in the text. So it's what a writer is using. So kind of like their arsenal. It might be something you could point to directly in a text, like I see that this is the allusion. This is a metaphor. Here's an example of personification. Another thing you might have just noticed that I did is I would use words like a, an, or the. So this is an image. This is an example of a metaphor. Typically, devices will be nouns, meaning you can put an a, an, or the in front of it. Think about these as like the nitty gritty details. So they're part of the text, as opposed to a strategy, which is more about what the writer does. So kind of like what these devices do, how they function, how they fit together to achieve a larger purpose. Typically, if a device is a noun, a strategy is going to be a verb because it's something that you can do. So it should be a verb. Think about it also as though it's like the method or the techniques. So you might take all those devices and how do they fit into each other to create a larger strategy. For example, when it comes to devices, you might say something like word choice, it's my device, helps to convey a tone. So a device can usually fit into a strategy. Or it might be something like the writer provides these images. That's what the writer is using in order to appeal to the reader's sense of pathos or something. So try to think about device in the sense of what a writer uses, something you can spot and point in the text, versus a strategy, which is a do. I have one analogy for you that might help. Think of the devices as though they are the tools, screwdriver, hammer, etc., things you could memorize. The strategies will be more of how you take those tools and you build the house. So you might have a game plan or a way that you're about to approach it. That's your strategy, and you might use certain devices in order to get you there. If you're not much of a builder, let me give you a few other analogies. So I'm a huge sports fan. I love Ohio State football. Such a tough game in December, but I'm still trying to get over it. So let's say it'd be impossible because Justin Fields is an amazing quarterback, but let's say the opposing team is trying to sack our quarterback. That's their strategy. How do we put pressure on the quarterback? Some of the devices they might choose would be something like, we're going to get off the line of scrimmage fast. I'm going to tell my players to cut to the side or to pivot on the outside of a linebacker. Those are the devices, those like techniques they would use in order to fulfill the strategy of how to put pressure on the quarterback. If you're more of an art fan, you might think of the devices as like your mediums, like watercolor, oil paints, ink, etc. And the strategies is how they come together to create the painting or the sketch itself. So if, as an artist, you are trying to achieve a particular mood, that's your strategy, that's your game plan going into the artwork, you might pick different devices such as brushstrokes, drawing techniques, multimedia, multimediums to use in your production. Those are the devices. So try to think devices more of like concrete, narrow, specific that help influence the strategy. Because of that, I think that that's a great way to think about the thesis statements. There are two thesis statements you might consider applying. One is going to be a device-driven thesis statement, meaning it's going to list out what the writer uses in the passage. The other is more of an idea-driven, and that's stating what the writer does in the passage. That's why I just spent so much time talking about device-first strategy, because that might help you think through what type of thesis statement you think you're capable of writing. So on your handout, I think it's task 3, I've given you space to take notes about the device-driven and the idea-driven. And I've said make sure you're including the pros and the cons, a description, and how to structure them. Because the rest of the presentation, I'll walk you through how do you do this. So for the device-driven thesis statement, again, that's what the writer is using. Here's an example. Albright strengthens the power of her speech through parallel structure, repetition of important values, and through personal experiences with empowered women to persuade them to persevere. I can see very clearly the student is going to talk about parallel structure, repetition of important ideas or values, and personal experiences with empowered women. That those are the three things Albright's using. So with these, I think there are some pros and cons just to be clear with you and again, let you know the pros and the cons and decide what's best for you. This type of approach is done quickly and easily, and it gives you, again, a very clear line that you will be following in your essay. However, the biggest problem with these, this is a good thesis statement, it's fine, but one of the biggest problems, it tends to lead to like a 5-paragraph essay that's like formulaic and dry. And then it usually, like this essay, it looks like it would end up being about parallel structure, repetition, and personal experiences, not necessarily about the rhetorical situation and what Albright's trying to achieve. It's more about what she's using, which again tends to limit the scope of your essay, makes it a little bit more formulaic. I think though that this is just fine, especially depending on how you're feeling when you get the prompt. You might need to just write something quickly and then get to your body paragraphs. So when it comes to how many choices do you include or what are your choices, I would think about how you're feeling in the moment and what you can successfully execute. Let me give you another thesis statement. So we have our first one here. I've added a new one. And I want you to think about how they're structured. So let's start talking not just what it is, but how do you structure them? Think about the components and how they all fit together. So for example, one thing you might notice is that they both start with the writer. Pause the recording, take about a minute, and try to identify what is the structure? What does each thesis statement do, and how are they structured? All right. What you might notice is, again, they both start with the audience or the writer, Albright. They both then provide some sort of a strong verb, like strengthens the power of her speech or connects with her audience. It's not going to be a generic word like uses. Instead, it's going to speak a little bit to her purpose. Then they both are going to use transition into the choices using that word through. So writer, verb, through, and then obviously the next thing would be the devices. And here they're all listed out. The second thesis has parallel syntax, repetition, assertions, and other tactics. So both are listing 3 devices. Again, you can choose 2. It's whatever you think you can successfully execute in the time frame. After giving their devices, both move into the purpose. Remember that the purpose is typically a to phrase. So to persuade or to convince. And then both end with the message. And I think the second thesis statement is better because the message goes beyond what the prompt said. So if you were using one as a model more so than the other, I'd go with the second one. So if you wanted to write a good thesis statement, you basically have the writer's name, a strong rhetorically sound verb, the word through, you're going to list the devices, then state the purpose and the message. That's what's going to give you a good thesis statement. However, if you want to have something that's a little bit better, then you're going to want to think about an idea-driven or more of a strategy-driven thesis statement. That's basically what the writer does in the passage. Here's an example. By inspiring the graduates to live courageously and then urging them to challenge adversity, Albright motivates the young women to break the glass ceiling and achieve equality. Sounds really nice, right? Remember that when it comes to something that's more of a strategy, it tends to have a strong verb. So here we can see that the choices that the student would be analyzing would be how she inspires the graduates to live courageously and urges them to challenge adversity. Those are the 2 choices that the student will be exploring in the essay. Again, some of the pros and cons. This is a great approach if you know you're going to be making multiple claims and you want your essay to be more about what she's trying to achieve, more about the purpose. And then it becomes about the text and not just, I can spot an image, I can see an example of alliteration, that it embeds that rhetorical situation nicer. However, they're really tough to construct, especially when you're under duress with a timed writing and you have so much that you're still trying to put together. It requires a more nuanced understanding of the text because you're thinking about how those devices function. What do they ultimately achieve? But what's nice is it doesn't limit you. So then if you end up kind of changing your mind a little bit later in the essay, then you know that you're still living under this umbrella of inspiring the graduates to live courageously, and then which rhetorical devices help to communicate that idea. So again, let's look at how they're structured. I've given you 2 additional thesis statements, so now you have 3 that all follow this idea-driven or strategy-driven approach. Think similarly to earlier. Think, how are they structured that I could then mimic or apply in my own timed writing? So for example, we know very clearly they both start with by. Pause the recording and this might take more of like 2 or 3 minutes to break these down by the components or the parts. You might also start thinking about, how do the choices differ from one another? Because I think that they have a similar structure, but each thesis statement is achieving something differently because of their choices. So pause it and I'll see you in about 2 or 3 minutes. All right, other than starting with by, you will notice that all 3 thesis statements almost immediately provide the strategies. And as I said to you guys before the break, think about how these strategies vary. So in the first one, remember they're all the verbs: inspiring and urging, opening and shifting, contrasting, relaying, and urging. They all start with a key verb. The first thesis statement is really looking at the appeals by inspiring and urging. So it's more about the ideas. The second is organized chronologically. So here's how it opens, and then she shifts to this. And then the third is more of the concrete methods. So how is she going to do this? By contrasting approaches to life, relaying inspiring stories, and urging graduates to aim high. This last one might feel the most like a device-driven thesis statement because again, it's very, very concrete. However, it still is kind of like open-ended and broad and abstract, and how she's contrasting approaches to life leaves things open for which devices you might choose in your essay. All right, so after giving the choices, the strategies, all of the students then reference the writer. They provide another strong verb similar to what you saw in the device-driven thesis. So in this case, it's motivates, conveys, and conveys. And then it concludes with the message. Try to break the glass ceiling, achieve equality, continue to fight for rights, that the noble path is in life is one of challenges, ... If this feels limiting to you, following that approach of by, strategies, writer, strong verb, message, that might feel very restricting. It too might feel a little formulaic, but keep in mind that you can vary it as long as you're like mixing and matching those pieces like a puzzle. So taking this first thesis statement, this great thesis statement, if to you it feels very formulaic, you'd maybe rewrite it this way, and it still achieves the same purpose. Albright contrasts approaches to life, relays inspiring stories, and urges graduates to aim high in order to convey to her audience that the noble path in life is one of challenges so that they will persevere and strive to change the world. It still has the same components. It's just moving them around and adding that phrase in order to. So if we had the equation before for a device-driven strategy, I can't really give you a clear-cut equation where you fill in the pieces, but I would encourage you to think writer, strategies, message, and then which of those words do you need, those filler words like by, in order to, or a strong verb. And that's how you go about creating a great thesis statement. just to help you see scope and the bigger picture. Like, okay, well, I understand now the difference between a good and a great thesis statement. Why does this matter? How does this fit into my essay? If you were to have a device-driven essay, here's the thesis you guys have seen before. I would assume that my first body paragraph would be about parallel structure, and I would give 2 examples of Albright using parallel structure in her speech. The second body paragraph is going to be about repetition of values, and I'm going to pull out 2 examples of repetition. And then the third body paragraph would be about empowered women, and I would probably pull out 2 of those anecdotes I think are most important to proving the message in that body paragraph. It's a fine essay. It's not going to upset me at all as an English teacher, but you can see this is more about those devices than it is about her ideas, as opposed to an idea-driven thesis statement like the one you have in front of you. My first body paragraph is going to be about how she inspires them to live courageously. Maybe one example would be hopeful diction. That's a device she uses to prove that idea. Another might be how she opens and closes with a call to action as a way to inspire them to live courageously. So both of my examples, they're different devices, but they both prove the same idea in that body paragraph. Or your second body paragraph would be about how she is attempting to urge them to challenge adversity. I might give an example of what I think is maybe the most powerful anecdote of powerful women throughout the world, and then the repetition of the word persevere. This essay is a lot more about what she's hoping to achieve through her writing. And you can kind of test your knowledge and flex that muscle a little bit by recognizing there are multiple choices that can, or multiple devices that can help communicate that idea. All right, so just to review, a good thesis statement will have at least 2 specific devices that a writer would use. Typically, they'll include the name of the writer, a strong verb, the purpose, and the message. Whereas a great thesis statement includes at least 2 strategies the writer does. Typically, those will be really strong verbs, like inspires or urges. They might be centered around these ideas like the appeals, shifts or the chronology of the passage, or the methods the writer uses. They too will include the name of the writer and the message. Again, that's why I spent so much time earlier talking about choices being devices and strategies, because that's really what I think hinders on a good versus a great, or at least in my classroom, that's what I would impart to my students. All right, so for your practice tonight, I'm sure it's no shocker, I'm going to ask for you to study the Margaret Thatcher speech. And on Friday, if you were part of our lesson, you wrote an introduction which included a thesis statement. Now, knowing what you know, I'm going to ask for you to revise your thesis. If it was great before, then maybe you don't have that AP practice. Maybe you tweak a little bit, like some of the language. Maybe you take it and you fit it into one of those structures. Or if it was good, maybe you revise it and you make it great. But that's your task for tonight, to revise your thesis, or if you didn't participate in Friday's lesson, write a thesis statement. And tomorrow we'll look through a sample or 2 and try to kind of figure out the extent to which your thesis statement mimics theirs. All right, thanks for watching. Happy Monday. I look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow.